Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So today we are going to discuss about audit evidence atau bukti audit. So audit evidence is any information used by the auditor to determine whether the information being audited is stated in accordance with the established criteria. So audit evidence is needed to support the auditor's opinion. So every information that the auditor used to determine whether the information being audited is accordance with the criteria is called audit evidence. So when the auditor checked the financial statement and he used journals, ledgers, or invoices, all that documents are audit evidence. So there are several decisions that the auditor needs to make regarding the audit evidence. First is which audit procedures to use. So we can see the example here. Examine the cash disbursement journal in the accounting system and compare the payee, the name, amount, and date with online information provided by the bank. So here the audit evidence is the cash disbursement journal. So the auditor find audit evidence which is in the form of journal, and the procedures regarding this journal is comparing the name, the amount, and date in the journal with the online information provided by the bank. Okay, so after getting the audit evidence, the auditor needs to determine what procedures will he conduct with that audit evidence that he already collect. And then the second one is what sample size to select for a given procedure. So if there is 500 transaction in a company and there are 500 journals, the auditor will never check all those 500 journal, but he or she will always take sample. So how many samples would the auditor choose to analyze? That's the one of the decision that he or she needs to make. So if there's 500 transaction, what is the sample size to select? Is it 50 or 20 or 60? And then the next one is which items to select from the population. So after the auditor determine the sample size to select, like let's take example, the auditor make the decision to choose 50 journals to analyze. So which 50 journals would the auditor select from the population? Is it the transaction that has the nominal of more than 50 millions or more than 10 millions or so on? So the number of item that the auditor wants to select from the population is also the decision that the auditor needs to make. And then the last one is when to perform the procedures. So will the auditor do this procedure at the beginning of the audit, in the middle, or at the end? Okay, so sampling. Sampling is the application of audit procedures to less than 100% of the population that provides a reasonable basis for the auditor to draw conclusion about the population as a whole. So as I mentioned before, the auditor will never check 100% of the transaction, but they will always analyze less than 100%. They will always take samples, but they still have to be sure that from the less than 100% of the transaction that they check, they need to be sure about the conclusion that they make. So when they check the cash disbursement transaction, they need to be sure that all the transaction in the cash disbursement is already correct as in the PSAK. Okay, so the sampling method, there are several sampling methods. There is random or judgment sampling. So random, just take randomly select the samples, or judgment sampling. Judgment is making several criteria to choose a sampling. And then the second one is block sampling. is choosing transaction in certain month, like probably taking a transaction in January and March and December, like that. So choosing transaction in certain month. And third is statistical sampling. They can use some application to choose how many samples will they use and which sample would they take. The auditor can use statistical sampling. Okay, so there is a standard in SPAP, SA 500. This is SA 500. Auditor standards require the auditors to accumulate sufficient appropriate evidence to support the opinion issued. Okay, so we will analyze more about these rules about the audit standard number 500. So because of the nature of the audit evidence and the cost consideration of doing an audit, it is unlikely that the auditor will be completely convinced that the opinion is correct. So they will not check 100% of the transaction, and they will not be completely convinced that the opinion is correct. However, the auditor must be persuaded that the opinion is correct with a high level of assurance. So, if they give opinion, they will not be completely convinced, but they will just be they will believe that the opinion is correct with a high level of assurance. There are two determinants of the persuasiveness of evidence, which are appropriateness and sufficiency. Okay, so we will discuss about these two items in the next video, in the next screen. Okay, so persuasiveness of evidence consists of first the sufficiency of evidence. Sufficiency is measured primarily by the sample size the auditor selects. So if there are 500 transactions and the auditor only checks 5 samples, so it will not be sufficient. The evidence should be sufficient. Okay, so the sample size must be in the correct amount. So if there are 500, probably the auditor can check like 50 or 100 transaction, not too little, but also not too much. Like the auditor doesn't have to check 490 like that. So the auditor should choose the correct amount of sample size. And the second one is the appropriateness of evidence. So the relevance and reliability of evidence. So where did the auditor get the evidence from? So the example before is the auditor analyzed the journals, right? The appropriateness of evidence means the independence of provider. So who provide the journals? Was it from inside the company? Journals always come from inside the company, right? But the data from the banks come from people outside the company, which is the bank. So it is more independent. So the more independent of the provider of the evidence, the data will be more relevant and reliable. Okay. And the next one is the effectiveness of client internal control. So if the internal control is more effective, the data will be more reliable. The degree of the objectivity and also the timeliness. So from what time, when did the auditor get the data from? If the auditor get the data from several years before, then it is less relevant and less reliable. Okay. So I will explain in Indonesia first. Okay. Jadi di standar audit nomor 500 itu bunyinya bahwa auditor itu harus merancang dan melaksanakan prosedur audit yang tepat sesuai dengan kondisi untuk memperoleh bukti audit yang cukup dan tepat. Jadi diatur di standar audit bahwa bukti audit itu harus cukup dan tepat. Nah, ini maksudnya apa? Yang pertama cukup itu artinya dari jumlahnya ya. Jadi kalau ada 500 transaksi itu tidak mungkin auditor akan memeriksa semua 500 transaksi tersebut, tapi pasti auditor itu akan mengambil sampel. Nah, kecukupan jumlah sampel itu adalah yang diatur di dalam standar ini tadi. Jumlahnya cukup gitu ya. Jadi kalau misalnya transaksinya 500, kalau auditor hanya memeriksa 5 transaksi, berarti itu terlalu sedikit ya. Berarti itu tidak memenuhi kecukupan itu tadi. Jadi auditor itu harus memperkirakan kira-kira dari 500 transaksi itu berapa yang sebaiknya dianalisa gitu ya. Apakah 50 atau 100 atau 150. Nah, itu tergantung dari keyakinan auditor gitu ya. Jadi kira-kira pada kondisi perusahaan seperti ini itu datanya meyakinkan nggak ya? Kalau auditor merasa datanya kurang meyakinkan, dia akan memilih sampel size yang lebih besar, misalnya 200 gitu. Tapi kalau dia auditornya melihat, wah ini internal kontrolnya sudah bagus nih, pengawasannya juga sudah bagus, saya cukup memeriksa 50 saja. Gitu. Nah, itu artinya kecukupan ya. Nah, yang kedua mengenai tepat atau ketepatan bukti. Nah, ketepatan bukti itu adalah terkait dengan relevansi dan reliabilitas buktinya. Yang pertama, independensi dari yang memberikan bukti. Jadi, misalnya tadi data dari bank. Nah, bank itu kan perusahaan, sebuah institusi di luar perusahaan ya. Nah, makanya kalau data dari bank itu lebih reliable karena dia independen. Banknya itu di luar perusahaan. Sedangkan data-data yang diperoleh di dalam perusahaan bisa jadi eh, kurang relevan dibandingkan dengan data yang diperoleh dari bank tadi, karena yang membuat perusahaan sendiri. Kemudian selanjutnya, effectiveness of clients internal control. Jadi semakin bagus internal controlnya, maka data yang diberikan itu semakin dapat diandalkan ya, relevan dan reliable. Selanjutnya adalah degree of objectivity. Jadi data itu eh, bisa objektif, bisa subjektif ya. Jadi misalnya wawancara dengan karyawan di perusahaan atau wawancara dengan manajer perusahaan itu subjektif karena dia bisa memberikan informasi yang eh, tidak benar gitu ya. Karena datanya tidak akurat kan hanya berupa kata-kata dari manajer, hanya berupa kata-kata dari karyawannya gitu. Nah, semakin objektif datanya, maka itu semakin dapat diandalkan. Tapi semakin subjektif, maka semakin tidak dapat diandalkan gitu ya. Selanjutnya adalah timeliness atau waktu perolehan data. Jadi semakin lama memperoleh datanya dari jarak audit, misalnya yang diaudit tahun 2024, datanya itu diperolehnya tahun 2000 gitu. Nah, itu kan jaraknya jauh ya, jadi itu menjadi semakin tidak relevan. Gitu. Jadi ada dua hal ini yang perlu diperhatikan oleh auditor dalam mengumpulkan bukti. Pertama, kecukupan, dan kedua, ketepatan atau kualitas dari bukti audit. Okay, the next one is type of audit evidence. There are several types of audit evidence. So first, there are physical examination. Physical examination is the auditor get the physic of the accounts. So the example is the auditor conduct cash of name, like they check the cash in the company, and also stock of name. This is when the auditor goes to the warehouse and check the inventory in the company. So they check the physical aspects of the account. The second one is confirmation. This is a confirmation to other parties outside the company, like confirmation to the bank and then confirmation to the customers. So the confirmation is also a form of audit evidence. And then the third one is inspection. So when the auditor conducts inspection to the warehouse, that is also type of audit evidence. And then the next one is analytical procedures. This is when the auditor does analysis about the data in the financial statement. So the example is when the auditor compare the sales with the account receivables and also the inventory. If the sales is increasing, the account receivable should increase too, and also the inventory. So if the auditor compares several accounts like this, sales with account receivables and inventory, that is called the analytical procedures. The next audit evidence is inquiries of the client. So here, the auditors conduct interview with the accountant about the cash disbursement procedures. So if the auditor conducts interviews with people in the company, which the manager or other employees, that is called inquiries of the client. And the next one is recalculation. So if the auditor recalculate the total asset and the depreciation or other accounts, like probably the cash disbursement, if the auditor recalculated, so that would be one type of audit evidence. Okay, so the last type of audit evidence is observation. So if the auditor observes the production process, or probably the auditor observe the warehouse or the accounting process or the accounting system, that is also a form of audit evidence. Okay, so after the auditor get the audit evidence, they need to do the procedures related to the audit evidence. So there are several audit procedures like inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, tracing and vouching. The auditor always does tracing and vouching. After this, we will see what is the difference between tracing and vouching. And counting, reperforming, and also computer-assisted audit techniques. Yeah, so this is the difference between vouching and tracing. So in vouching, the auditor will check the ledger or the journal and find the source document, like the invoices of the transaction, like that. This is to check the validity of the transaction. But when the auditor first check the source document, like the invoices, and then after finding the invoices, the auditor find the ledger or journal, it is called tracing. The aim of tracing is to check the completeness of the transaction. So whether all the transaction is already recorded in the ledger or journal. Nah, jadi bedanya vouching dan tracing ya. Ini adalah salah satu prosedur audit. Jadi kalau misalnya auditor itu mengumpulkan bukti audit berupa buku besar atau jurnal, nah ini bukti auditnya ya ini ya. Nah, kemudian prosedur audit yang dilakukan adalah vouching. Nah, artinya dia akan mencocokkan buku besar atau jurnal ini dengan bukti dokumennya seperti tadi faktur gitu ya, kemudian bukti-bukti lain gitu. Misalnya dia mengecek pembelian persediaan. Nah, langsung dia cek ke gudang, ada nggak nih barang yang dibeli? Eh, gitu. Nah, itu namanya vouching ya. Jadi memeriksa catatannya ke bukti itu namanya vouching. Tujuannya untuk validity atau validitas. Jadi eh, pencatatan buku besar atau jurnalnya itu benar-benar ada nggak transaksinya gitu ya. Nah, itu namanya vouching. Sedangkan kebalikannya, tracing itu dari sumber dokumen. Jadi bukti auditnya itu berupa sumber dokumen, berupa faktur, ini ya, catatan-catatan pembukuan lain, itu ditelusuri apakah transaksi tersebut sudah dicatat di dalam buku besar dan jurnal. Gitu ya. Jadi vouching dan tracing ini selalu dilakukan dalam proses audit. Okay, so that's all that we are discussing about audit evidence. You can read the complete information about audit evidence in the literature, and also you can browse on the internet about audit evidence. Thank you, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.